the MCAT podcast, session number 149. A collaboration between the medical school headquarters and Next Step Test Prep, the MCAT podcast is here to make sure you have the information you need to succeed on your MCAT test day. We all know that the MCAT is one of the biggest hurdles you'll face as a pre-med, and we're here to give you the motivation and information that you need to know to help get you the score you deserve so you can one day call yourself a physician. Welcome to the MCAT podcast. Thank you for taking some time to join us today. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, your host here every week. If you don't know, I host the pre-med years. Now, I've talked to a lot of you who are listening to this podcast, but don't listen to the pre-med years. That's like changing your tires, but forgetting to put oil in the engine. You can get an amazing score on the MCAT, but if you're not doing everything else for your application, then you're not going to do very well. And I tell this story all the time now because it is an amazing example of why GPA and MCAT aren't everything. I had a discussion with a student who had a 3.9 and a 519 on her MCAT and didn't get any interviews because she was missing a lot of stuff in her application. She didn't do a good job of showing why she wanted to be a doctor. She didn't have any shadowing or any clinical experience. Those are all important, and those are all things that we talk about on the Pre-Med Years podcast. So go check that out, premedyears.com. Today, we are going to talk about some changes at the AAMC in terms of their prep resources. Claire, back for some more MCAT podcasts. How you doing?
I am great today. How are you?
I am also amazing. Last week, we talked all about reviewing Q banks. This week, let's talk about a specific type of test, the AAMC tests and Q banks. And it's a very common thing that students get access to, whether they're getting access for free through the Next Step course or tutoring, or they're going out and buying them and using books as extra resources. But I think there are some unique things about the AAMC resources that we want to talk about and make sure that students understand while they are using those resources. Yes?
Definitely. Yeah, so the AAMC resources are probably something that virtually every student purchases, or you might get them for free through a fee reduction program or through a course like the Next Step course. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about how to use them and like what they're best used for. But overall, they're really, really good, right? Like they're the resource. They're made by the test makers. They're great. They are a little bit limited in the amount available, so that's why you'll turn to other like great full lengths, like the Next Step full lengths. But interestingly, the AAMC has their own practice website, basically. And so that's where you can take practice AAMC full lengths. You can use their other resources, which are called like the question packs and like the section bank. And all these resources you can use in different ways, like if you want to do so optimally. But they actually have been updating that website recently, and they've just been adding some functionality and some features. So this is a good time to be talking about all of this.
Yeah, so let's talk about those updates. I think it was either a year or two ago as we're recording this that they made some big changes with their platform and the interface. And I think we talked about those on the podcast at some point. I think that was with Brian still. But there are some new changes afoot there.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think I listened to that podcast, actually. I think that was a good one. But yeah, so basically the AAMC updated back in, I believe it was October of 2018 or it was approximately a year ago when they switched to this new bench prep system. So previously they had their own practice system, and it was the interface that they used was like identical to what you'd actually see on the MCAT, which you'd expect. But then they switched to this new bench prep system. And basically the big change that came along with that was that their full lengths were now in the same MCAT-like interface. So if you've ever taken a practice test, you've seen like the blue color, you've seen like the highlight tool. Their practice full lengths were exactly that. But they had this separate interface for their QPACs, their section bank, their official guide questions that they call essentially the practice interface. And it looked totally different, and it didn't have all the same features, all the same functionality. And one thing we heard a ton from students and tutors when this first launched was that that AAMC practice interface didn't even have something like highlighting. So if you want to practice your highlighting strategy, you would need to practice it using other resources or using the actual AAMC full lengths. And they just recently updated that interface so it does include highlighting. So now you can get a little bit more even out of those practice resources. So it's really important to know how to utilize them.
Let's talk about those resources. I think one of the biggest complaints that I see from students is the inadequacy, I think, if that's the right word, of the explanations as a student is going through the QBank or going through the full-length exams. And it's funny, I saw a meme on Reddit actually recently where it's like, it was a sign that said, the answer is wrong because the answer is wrong. And they're like making a joke about how that's the explanation on the AAMC exams. For a student who's going through and maybe only utilizing the AAMC exams, how do you help them get over that? Because as we talked about in the last episode, it's the review and going through the explanations that really helps increase scores.
Totally. So that is a very, very common complaint. And basically, the idea is that the AAMC is an organization that administers the test. And typically with organizations like that, they're not focused on explanations. Like, they're not meant to be training tools so much as testing tools. And that can be really frustrating if indeed you are a student who's, say, like only using the AAMC, because you might think, oh, I just did this practice. I just did this question pack, or I just did like 3 passages from the section bank, and they were really hard. But then I see these explanations that are like only 1 sentence long, and it's not nearly enough to tell me where I went wrong. So the important thing is really just your mindset around all of this. So, like, for example, we've previously said that you should spend at least as much time reviewing as you did initially taking a practice test or other resource. And sometimes you can, or it's ideal to spend up to twice as long. And for the AAMC, I highly, highly recommend spending twice as long reviewing as you did taking it, because these explanations usually do point you in the right direction with regard to why a certain answer choice is right. But it can be really hard to make those cognitive jumps, right? Like, if you look at other explanations, like the next step explanations, you'll see that often they're very, very long. So like multiple paragraphs long. And that's usually because, we're trying to get you to make all those jumps, like by actually telling you what they are. Like, oh, first step, you go here. Next step, here's how you figure out that this is the right graph to look at. And the AAMC doesn't have that, but you can use their explanation as guidance. And if you need to bring in other resources, I highly recommend having books near you to look up unfamiliar terms, because usually they'll just explain why the right answer is right in the sciences and not why the wrong answers are wrong. So you absolutely might need to look up, A, B, and D are wrong. There are all these unfamiliar terms. I need to look them up using that, or Khan Academy or something.
And for going back kind of to the user interface, because it's different than the real kind of test exam, where you're going and sitting in the Pearson Center, how do you instruct a student to kind of make sure that they're not getting used to one thing when the real thing is going to be a little different?
Definitely. So one thing that I do typically recommend for this reason and other reasons also is to really spread out your AAMC practice. So I've seen a lot of students, and I've seen students say this on Reddit, and I've also had students who will have this mentality where they'll use like just like the AAMC section bank and the question packs, like they'll pack all of that into like the last 3 weeks of their prep. But then you do run into this issue where it's like, oh, all the practice I'm doing is in this interface that doesn't look like the real thing, even though it is AAMC and the content is great. But then the only time I'm seeing the actual exam-like interface is through the full lengths that I might be doing like once a week. So there's a benefit to spreading it out. And the other benefit to that is just that even if you haven't like finished your content review, for example, it's really helpful to start getting into the AAMC's mindset. So let's say instead of packing all of those resources in your last 3 weeks, you actually, let's say you're studying for 4 months, and 2 months in, or even a month and a half in, you start doing AAMC practice. You can certainly review it all again when you get to the end, very close to your test date. But that way you can sprinkle in some other practice from other sources potentially that do resemble the exam interface, and then just have a more balanced prep. And then you also tend to get more time for review, because packing in the whole section bank in a week or something like that isn't going to give you the time you need to really dig into it and get the most out of it.
What else do we need to talk about with the AAMC materials that students maybe struggle with or don't understand?
Well, I think my number one thing I like to remind students is just exactly what the AAMC materials are, like the full scope, because we talk a lot about the full lengths. We talked today a little bit about the question packs and section bank. But there are other resources also. So the key one that I think is just phenomenal practice is the AAMC official guide questions. So this is a relatively short resource, which is always the issue. Like you're like, well, I need more practice than just this. But the passages are really good. They're very very MCAT-like. And so if you are an MCAT student and you haven't heard of this resource, I just want to let you know that it is out there. It's basically the length of half of an MCAT. And it's great practice.
All right, there you have it. I hope you got a lot of good information out of today, how to use the AAMC material, how to continue to maximize your score, maximize your resources. If you are looking for more resources, go to MCATcoursereview.com. That will take you to a YouTube video where I break down Next Steps course, their MCAT course, and why I think it's the best course out there for the money and for you. Again, MCATcoursereview.com. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT Podcast.
This is MedEd Media.